used as laborers. Slave owners viewed enslaved individuals as valuable assets and sought to expand their workforce by encouraging or coercing their slaves to have children. The offspring of these slaves would become property and contribute to the slaveholders' economic interests. This practice was prevalent, particularly in the southern states. Enslaved women, in particular, were seen as valuable commodities, their reproductive capabilities exploited to fulfill the economic interests of their owners. To understand the lived experiences of these women, we turn to various historical accounts, including testimonies from enslaved individuals themselves. Although a lot of evidence has been buried and some destroyed, we can draw upon broader narratives and personal testimonies to grasp the impact of this practice. Frederick Douglass, a prominent abolitionist and former enslaved person, provides insight into this disturbing reality in his narrative. He vividly describes the harsh circumstances faced by enslaved women, recounting their exploitation as breeding machines. In his words, "I've often been weakened at the dawn of day by the most heart-rending shrieks of an own aunt of mine, whom he used to tie up to a joist and whip upon her naked back, till she was literally covered with blood. No words, no tears, no prayers from his gory victim seemed to move his iron heart from its bloody purpose. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped, and where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped longest." Testimonies like Douglass's shed light on slave breeding was a slave multiplication agenda implemented by slave owners through forced sexual relations between male and female slaves, and between slave owners and their female slaves. Fact number 2. The slave breeding industry was more prevalent in the southern states of the United States, where large-scale plantation agriculture was the primary economic system. The deep entrenchment of the slave breeding industry in the southern states perpetuated a system of human bondage and dehumanization. This dehumanizing perspective reduced human beings to mere commodities. While the focus of slave breeding often centers on enslaved women, it is important to acknowledge that enslaved men also faced vulnerability in being used for slave breeding purposes. Fact number 5. Some plantation owners often rewarded enslaved men who could impregnate the most women. It is believed that slave masters incentivized the ability to impregnate the most slave women. This sounds crazy, but it was the reality of these men. The dehumanizing and exploitation within the institution of slavery extended to a disturbing practice where some plantation owners incentivized and rewarded enslaved men who could impregnate the most women. Enslaved men who were successful in impregnating multiple women became objects of admiration and envy within the enslaved community. However, this so-called reward system further perpetuated the dehumanizing and objectification of enslaved individuals, reducing them to mere breeding machines. Thomas Nicholson, an enslaved man owned by John Randolph of Virginia, was another individual who was rumored to have been rewarded for his ability to father children with multiple enslaved women on the Randolph plantation. His role as a breeding stud earned him certain privileges and a somewhat elevated status compared to other enslaved individuals. Another disturbing example of this practice is the case of one wealthy South Carolina plantation owner, James Hammond. In his diary, Hammond detailed how he bred enslaved people for profit and offered rewards to the enslaved men who could impregnate the most women, adding that it was a great stimulus for them. Some of these rewards include extra food, improved work conditions, and better clothes. Despite these special privileges, these men were still subjected to the brutal conditions of slavery. These stories highlight the twisted mindset of slaveholders who saw the exploitation of enslaved bodies as a means to increase their wealth and power. Fact